Hello, and welcome to Behind the Screens. I'm your host, the DM from Flavored Enemy. We're going to be talking to several different DMs from all manners of experience and levels of skill, and talking to them about their different tips and tricks and how they go about taking on the monumental task that is DMing. Now, for sake of ease, we're going to be sticking to Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder, but you can take these tips and tricks and apply them to your game as you see fit. Yeah, stay tuned and enjoy, and by all means, send us your requests for things you want us to cover at flavoredenemy@gmail.com. Stay tuned and enjoy. Today we're going to be talking about world building and, kind of just how to actually build a world of your own or take a world that has already been crafted and making your own, adding little details and flares and bits to kind of like make it feel more alive and less rigid. Today with me, I have um, today with me, I have Francis from Flavored Enemy. Why don't you go ahead and tell us a little about you, Francis?
What's up, y'all? Uh, so I'm a newer DM. I've been doing it actually only 3 sessions now, but I've been working on building this world to put my players into for it's been probably about 6 months of working on it so far. And yeah, just creating everything even down to the commerce.
And I'm the DM over at Flavored Enemy. I've been DMing now for about 6 years. And I've spent the last 3 years building the world of Vittore, which the Tales of Vittore, Flavored Enemy, takes place on. Having poured a lot of detail into the divinity and religious structures, as well as city layouts and commerce and world history. So to kind of get us started on the subject, what's what's the first thing that you feel is like the most important thing to broach when it comes to tackling the huge mountain that is world building?
Apparently, it's naming your world starting with V, because mine's Velicor. Uh, but I think really, for me, the big thing with the world building was I had an idea that I wanted to use for a world-changing arc of a campaign. And I had that one little niche area, and it involved a new race that I wanted to put in that wasn't in, the Wizard's books that I haven't dealt with before. So for me, I found taking that one location that I want the big changes and pretty much the majority of this arc to take place in. And I worked outwards from there, and I've heard different people with different things. Some say start big, work your way in. I just found that taking this one point the most about in my head already, and in a sense spider webbing from there to find, like, for using commerce is I knew what kind of trade routes I wanted, so from there I could determine where the next major cities moving outward would be, to start to really build up the infrastructure, I guess, so to say. And then from there I was able to start to play around with race interactions, trade, and then the types of topography.
Yeah, and I think that's like just goes to show about like how everyone mentally is on different wavelengths. So not everyone functions the exact same way, especially when it comes to something as big as world building. because like on some instances it's easier to start with like a smaller scope and like kind of work your way outwards. Some people like to get all the basics done first and work inwards. Um, I feel like I had a bit more of like a narrative approach to it. When I first created Vittore, the concept was I created the creation mythos, so like how the world was born, like what all happened in order for this world to be born. I took inspirations from how Aztec creation mythos talked about how the world was created. Also looking at even like the Christian creation of the world and all the different kinds of ways that these were described and all the rich and flavorful descriptions that were given. And I kind of used those as inspiration to kind of get a generic outline of, I want, to describe this, address this, talk about this, and went through creating the creation mythos. And then once I had a good idea of the mythology behind the world and could address different things like, this one particular race is, connected to this one particular aspect of the creation mythos. For example, in Vittore, the Firum, which are a phoenix-like Avarian race, who are directly related to and created by Solus, who is the sun serpent, the actual coiled sun itself. When he spit fire down to the earth, down to Vittore, it created them upon impact. Now, maybe this isn't exactly what happened. Maybe this is just rich, flavorful text to describe something. But because of that's how the world views it, that's how Vittore views it, it creates this like really neat and tidy connection between the two.
Yeah, and it's funny. The pantheons and the gods and stuff was definitely one of least worked on before the game started, and by least worked on, I mean I definitely didn't, because I was so stuck on trade routes, I guess. But I think one of the things that I love about the DMing side, even while building the world, is the improvisation aspect of it. So when one of my players asked me about it, and we were like just about gonna get started, uh, you get to sort of think on your feet. And so I made this world that sits almost between the planes. So when people go through different portals and stuff, technically they're passing through this realm. So it opens up a lot of options for me too in the future for bringing in different races or sending players out into either other pre-built worlds or any of the other planes. But it also lets me play around with the mythos that different people in my world have. And that was a lot of fun actually to start to build on. One of my players was like, "What gods are there?" And I was like, "What gods are there?" Um, I decided that because a lot of places in the Wizards world and all of the worlds are like multiversed, that with having portals and plane portals going through, that this was almost like an intersection that some that I could sort of pull from places that were around, but in the future I can also send players to other places fairly easily.
Well, I mean, so like when you're coming up with your world building concepts, right? And the things that are
Mm-hmm.
trying to take it from a generic setting to a lived in world, right? What kind of things do you add in order to give it that feeling of detail?
For that, I definitely try and put things that are enough rooted in experiences that we've had in reality so that the emotions and the feelings of the players also gets pulled into the world. So, like I was saying with the racism between the Winter Elves and the Drow, and in the cities, having the different levels of living, going through and really taking your time when you bring players into a new area to give the description, pull the setting, really just slow it down, take the time, build the world and the words for them, and bring them in. So, if they walk in just like, a slum, really bring in, even like explain to them how it smells, tell them, about someone that they may see sitting on the side of the road, begging for some money. Things that people have seen even just walking, downtown city, wherever you might be, type thing. And really trying to pull not just the visual of it, but pull the emotion and pull in the other senses as well. And just, as a DM, you're a storyteller, so you have to tell the whole story.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that's like, some concepts that you could end up using to describe any kind of little details, or even just the big things. For example, different groups or different peoples in different areas might have different relationships with the same thing. So, for example, let's say, a cult of the Dragon Queen might have a different relationship with the Dragon Queen, and then let's say um, a free loving adventuring society, or just kind of like detailing those stark differences in the ways that people view things and are related to things in comparison to each other. For example, the residents of the coal ring in Alteris may view it differently than, let's say if a Spriggan from Telmarin walked through there and saw everything that was going on there. And, just kind of giving that unique description that leaves it to be viewed by your party. You don't want to, in my experience, you don't want to evoke the emotion for the player, for the character. You want to provide vague enough verbiage and wordage while you're describing the place that they can view it within their mind's eye, but that view has like a viewpoint from different angles based off of their backstory, where they're from, their races and classes and social standing, stuff like that. And to kind of give that unique viewpoint of the world from different angles is what I feel is how you get like this multi-layered type of world, rather than like a two-dimensional looking down from the top kind of thing.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's... I guess that's one thing is I know that I've fallen prey to it, is giving too much description before. Because there, like you were saying, there's that... You have to give enough. And I know that, I've fallen prey to giving too much. Especially on, like, one NPC where I made my players cry because they killed him, but that's their fault for being murder hobos.
Yeah, that deserves a whole nother episode just discussing murder hobos.
Oh my god, it's my sister. I spent my whole second session was like 3 hours long. My party did not move from where they were, but we went from 2 bodies to 8.
That's about right.
And it was like, oh my god, guys. And like, how do you explain the world to someone when they don't move.
True, true.
But I mean, back to world building. One thing that one of
Yeah.
my friends suggested to me, and I don't know if you'll keep this chunk in it, but it's called World Anvil. And for someone who is fresh to building like a whole world to themselves, it was really handy to get started on because it gives like prompts and ideas for like, well, what about this and what about that? And you can make little articles and keep those notes organized that way.
Yeah.
So I found that really interesting just to get started.
No, I definitely agree. I definitely agree. One of the ones that I used when I was first getting into DMing was Don John, which is a set of tools that have for all kinds of different TTRPGs, including D&D, Pathfinder, Starfinder, all kinds of stuff. And they had different things like random town generators and different little things that you can randomly generate taverns and shops and generate their whatever items that they had within the
Oh,
shops.
fun.
Um, and that was a fun little tool that I used at the beginning to kind of get an idea. And it also, playing around with those random generators, helped me to figure out what kinds of things I would need to think about when actually going to craft my own world. It's like little things that may seem insignificant on the outside, like for example, coming up with uh, a special signature dish that each tavern had. It seems insignificant,
But every time a
but
player walks in, we ask what's on the menu.
exactly, and even and you know what, if you're in Spokestat and you head to Gluttony Gals, you know what's on the menu. It's meat, and it's always on the menu.
It's
Um,
whatever died last.
yeah, exactly. Um, but it also adds character to that tavern, especially because taverns are, besides dungeons, probably the place that players and characters spend the most of their time. So fleshing out those locations, giving them a unique vibe and a unique like atmosphere that is unique to that tavern makes it feel like it's something different. I shouldn't walk into it's not like an Applebee's where you walk into one in any city and they're all the same. Each one needs to be different.
Applebee's. Oh my god.
And I mean, unless you want to have a set of chain taverns across your world. I'm not saying that's a bad idea. It is something you can do. I mean, take a look at Bullywugs from Dungeons and Daddies. They got one in every city.
Every city. Well, I suppose it
But
saves some time in building the tavern each time, right?
it does. Uh, but and it kind of depends on your world, and what all kind of vibe and atmosphere you're trying to go for on the general scale. Um, so like there's working down in the little details like that, and then there is the grander scope of things. So like regions, climates. Are you gonna use biomes? Are you gonna use biomes that are similar to Earth, whereas the poles are Arctic, and the closer you get to the middle, the more humid it gets? Um, are you going to inverse that? Are you even going to use a sphere-based world? Maybe you have a cube. Maybe your Earth is flat. And all things that you can address from the top going down.
Yeah. I definitely found with that I had a lot of fun building my continent map and breaking out the provinces and stuff.
Yeah.
It even just helped, like, sort of just scribbling it around a few times and then being the lovely little Photoshop nerd that I am. Uh, I found this very helpful, is there's a bunch of free cartography brushes that you can get.
Yes.
And just being able to like be like, well, what if I put a mountain range here? Because then I was able to think of it in a 3D term instead of just like this flat amoeba that I had drawn in front of me.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
sort of helps figure out too, like, okay, if I've got mountains here and forests here, okay, maybe this race comes from this region, and breaking
Yes.
it down
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah. I kind of used because I used incarnate. That's INK-RNate.
Yeah, I
To
sorry.
yeah that's what I used for my world for when I made the maps for Vittore and Chrysanthia. Is I used that to kind of like get an idea of the regions and where they're situated. How do I separate things and such? And kind of playing around with it, it kind of starts to spark different little ideas that then make it into the mythos of the world.
Yeah. Also, if you, or at least for me, there was a whole thing to the west that I didn't know what I wanted to do with, so I just cut it off by mountain range and said lore-wise that people haven't been there for a really long time. Because there's some magical, something blocking it. So,
Yeah.
like, you don't, me, I found I didn't need to have the world, like, map 100% built. Just have, like, I have ideas for in there. I just don't know how to put them in yet, and my players aren't close enough to it yet, so I can work on it.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. You don't have to have all the answers now. You don't have to have all the answers before you do anything with the world. You're allowed to create as you go. You're allowed to wing it. That's actually probably the best piece of advice I can give to any DM is that, hey, it's okay to wing it sometimes. You don't have to prepare everything.
Yeah, and like your players can add to it too if something happens that you're like, oh, that's kind of nifty, or if a player asks.
So yeah, so we've just opened up the floor for some questions. So we have one user who is one of our players who plays Quincy, and he wants to know, in the world creation, why does the sun go down at night? So, in your world, why does the sun go down at night, and how do you handle that?
And I have not actually considered that question, because in my head it's just world is globe, globe do spin, sun go away. But really, if I think about it, it would probably more so have to do with the fact that it is in this weird in-between of the planes that the sun would almost, in a sense, glitch in and out across the different planes, almost in a time, like, you wouldn't really notice it, but it would be going in and out of the different planes, and it would eventually cross over a threshold that would have it be going down. I still work in a globe situation.
Yeah. See, and then like you can address all kinds of like in Vittore, since Solus, the sun serpent, is the actual sun itself. I actually have it to where it doesn't. There is no rotation. There is no spinning, anything like that. What happens is that systemically, the quiet, who is, one of my demon princesses, specifically the demon queen, she balances night and day. So systemically, she dances across the sky, blotting out Solus by slowly covering him up, because she comes in between Vittore in him.
Okay.
So like something, and like it's just a fun little bit there that some people might be like, oh, hey, this is how the people within Vittore would answer that question. But is that actually what happens? Who
Now,
knows?
if the world isn't
Um,
spinning, how do we stay on?
exactly, exactly. See, but this is from the viewpoint of the residents of Vittore. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the truth.
That's the
You know,
lore for what happens. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. So let's see here. I have another question. Here we go. Um, so our fellow player Trover, he plays Trover on Flavored Enemy, wants to know. I'm pretty sure Trover's been hitting the drinking gourd a little too hard, but I'm going to read this for
I
word. We can
believe in
figure it
you.
out as we go along. Were NPCs adventurers, or did some grow to take over the shop or job they do?
Okay. Uh, and
Or like we're like NPCs within the world. Did you have them be adventurers before they became the NPCs, or kind of how you address that?
and I think that sort of comes down to the question of what shop or tavern or whatever it is, and in what city. Like, for me, I have the biggest city in the expanse for the Winter Elves. The Winter Elves find themselves to be better than, so a lot of them don't become adventurers. But because so much commerce goes through there with all of the minerals, they definitely are more of the kind to stay in the family business and take over the shop or whatever with that. Whereas in Harthino, my middle province, it's farmland, it's where the slaughterhouse is that my players are in. Stuff like that. There's definitely more previous adventurers in there who have gone around and found that this is a very peaceful place to sort of take root after they've, gone around and gotten their butts handed to them sometimes. So I think.
Yeah, yeah, right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's very much dependent on where it is and what kind of, business or whatever it might be is.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And there's certain ones that it makes sense for them to have been adventurers. You wouldn't have a a commoner running a magic item shop. No.
They'd blow up.
Um, you wouldn't. Yeah, you wouldn't have a commoner or a non-adventurer running a adventuring guild. In a world filled with clerics who are able to heal all kinds of wounds, you wouldn't have a non-studious uh, clerics, someone who actually just followed the belief rather than practice. You wouldn't have them running a clinic. Um, and I think it just all kind of like pertains to the particular scenario, particular situation you find yourself in, including location, like you said, and the world itself too. For example, you know you could have a world, and this is entirely possible. This might shock some people. You could have a world where magic is not present, meaning no clerical holy abilities, no sorcerers, warlocks, or wizards.
Then how will. Oh,
Strictly martial abilities.
no, now we're getting into,
That,
create your own fireball.
exactly, exactly. And and kind of when you're talking about the world itself, right? In a world like that, in a world like that where there is no magic to support society, you're looking more into this world where everyone has at least some sort of martial training to protect themselves. And kind of something that you address when you're creating the world is, what's the general consensus on protection? Is that something that if there's kingdoms that exist, is there something that the kingdoms do? Do they protect the commoners? Are the commoners expected to protect themselves? Is there mandatory military service? All these questions you can ask to determine what the actual level of involvement within the adventuring community is, and therefore how many of them exist in the world. And then finally, with that, what all they would do after they're done adventuring. You know, you have like a level 10 fighter who retires, right? And he's still got another 30 years left before he kicks the bucket. Well, what's he going to do for those next 30 years? If he's got enough gold saved up from his venturing days, he's not really worried about that, but he just wants something to fill his time. So maybe he takes up being like the man at arms for the kingdom, teaching swordsmanship. You know, and I think that just kind of like helps also flesh out the diversity of the world itself. Um, so next question we have from Z is, will there be dragons? And I think that is a general question of whether or not there will be dragons in any particular homebrew world. I'm going to kind of take this and run with it. So how do you feel about addressing such a like monumental aspect of fantasy worlds, such as dragons or magic or wizarding, stuff like that? Things that are like so monumentally ingrained into fantasy worlds that if you have a fantasy world that doesn't have it, it feels weird. For example, like Lord of the Rings, still has Smaug, even though it's its own living thing outside of all normal fantasy. Uh, and it kind of like in every single aspect of fantasy that you can think of, there is at least something that's like it. So how do you handle that when it comes to your world? Is it something that you feel is necessary, or is it something that you kind of just push off to the side?
Now for fantasy creatures, like monsters and such, I definitely haven't fully addressed that myself, I'll be honest with you there. But for the magic aspect of things, I definitely spent a long time debating about how common it is and how widespread it is and how much magic knowledge from one area has been shared with other areas. Because I find that magic can very much be like even as distinct as accents from regions, that other like even just if there's more magic available in this world, that even in a smaller town, ever outside of the big cities with the scholars and everything, that they can create their own spells and tweak ones that they may have learned or whatever. And I really like the idea that by watching someone do essentially the same spell as someone else, you can get a general idea of where either they learned it or where they grew up, kind of thing. So for me, magic in itself is a big thing that I wanted to incorporate in the world, just because I find that it can be so distinct. And I've played in a world where magic was super rare, and that was really interesting too, because it narrowed down. There were only like 2 of us that were magic users in the party, and it also narrowed down the types of items that you could get, because suddenly some of those rare and whatever items that are magical items might not exist anymore. But for the fantasy mythos, magic for me was big in deciding and even sort of just distributing around the provinces. Will there be dragons in mine? Yes, there's going to be at least 1 dragon, but that's because I want to play a dragon as a DM. But I never really actually considered the fantasy creatures like you were saying. Only the magic side.
So that kind of ties directly into how monsters are created in my world, right? So in Vitore, monsters are created by Dendar, the night serpent, eating the nightmares of mortals. And when she does that, she births the nightmares as flesh and blood creatures. These become monstrosities and aberrations.
I'm
So
so glad she can't eat my nightmares.
And
Oh my god.
that's where the premise comes from. I actually take nightmares and different studies of nightmares, my own nightmares, friends of mine nightmares, and turn them into flesh and blood creatures. For one example, the turnip crab, which is a monster native to Vitore. Now, the turnip crab is nightmare fuel. It is basically functions like a hermit crab, right? It has a secretion of a liquid on its back that, when it burrows into a organic material, which it does so by piercing into the organic material and burrowing in, the secretion slowly starts to turn the organic material into a steel-like substance. That does not change the actual appearance of the organic material. It just hardens it to that steel-like substance. Now, the reason it got its name is because of the fact that these turnip crabs love to bury themselves into turnips. And farmers would go to pick the turnips, and they'd be rock hard. And this is where the nightmare fuel happens. A turnip crab, upon getting scared, lurches out at the person that is picking it up or messing with it. And when it does so, it makes a melee attack against it, and upon a hit, the target would have to make a dexterity saving throw. And upon a fail, the turnip crab burrows into the person, slowly inflicting the petrified condition upon them.
No, that's
similar
fine.
to Medusa stare. And turns
Remind me to never pick up any turnip in this world.
Yeah, so turnip crabs, nightmare fuel. So like when I'm creating a homebrew monster or homebrew creature, I like to address the general concept before I go to anything else. So for example, there's another one, fern lizards. Fern lizards, I wanted to make sure that I balanced the cute and cuddly and friendly creatures with the monstrosity type creatures. So fern lizards are super adorable. They are, if you're not a fairy. If you are a fairy, they are nightmare fuel. But if you're not a fairy, they actually are really cute. They're really friendly, docile, and are playful when it comes to making friends with mortals and with human-like creatures. So when not moving, they are indiscernible from ferns, hence their name, fern lizards. So they have this giant plant-like thing growing out of its back. And once they, another thing that makes them kind of interesting is the fact that they actually eat magic. And I created them as kind of like this like cute pest-like creature, similar to like how rats are in our society, but I wanted to make them cute, so you didn't want to kill them.
Okay, but rats are cute.
Yeah, yeah, to some people, not to everybody. But
I know.
so like fern lizards love eating potions, small magical items, anything magical they can get their maws on, they'll eat them. Now, this is where the nightmare fuel happens. Fairies are innately magical creatures and small. Fern lizards love eating fairies and pixies and will-o-wisps. And the reason that they do this is because they grow, like they actually can grow in size based off of how much magic they've eaten. So as fern lizards slowly start to get bigger, it's how much magic they've actually eaten. And, creating little creatures like this, really helps with that world building stuff too, because like you can add these things in that are unique to your world.
Yeah.
So,
no, that's a lot of fun for monsters, but I think my nightmare would be the big bad end guy, but,
well, we'll get to that.
Right?
Z would like to know, what is your opinion on the concept of generational adventures, i.e. offspring?
You don't want to talk about the nature of infinity.
Oh, I don't want to talk about the nature of infinity. We could go on for hours. And we don't.
Dang, I was just reading.
We don't have time for that.
Like, I was trying to get caught up on the new news of what happened to infinity.
Yeah.
Generational adventures. I actually really like that idea, depending on, who's playing it, how far in the future, or even if someone like... Oh my god, I have forgotten their name already. Hold on. That sound terrible. Names are like the worst thing for me. Who is our Minotaur?
That'd be Tig.
Damn it! I knew I was trying to think of something. But, like in Flavored Enemy with Tig, they're already in that generational, maybe not adventure, but of shop and everything. So there's a history there, and maybe her parents did adventure before, or if... I don't know, I think that adventuring can also, in a sense, pass down through generations like shop owner, especially in a world where, there's a lot of potential turmoil or things that need to be done, and not everyone has the abilities to do it. So it's...
Yeah.
I like generational in that aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. I think that my opinion on generational adventures is fairly evident from that. The two of the characters from the Flavored Enemy, the King's Call, our first season of the podcast. Two of them became big players within Latore, and their daughter is an adventurer. And kind of the one thing I played around with that is the fact that, growing up, right? IRL, in real life, growing up, you always hear, "Oh, you're so much like your mom. You're so much like your dad," or whatnot. And growing up, you're like, "I will never be like them. And so you do the
Oh my
exact
god.
opposite things, right? And that's exactly what happened with Aurora. Aurora is always told that she looks like her mom, and so her mom, being a barbarian, she went the exact opposite way and became a peace-loving wizard. Um, Even though she ended up being an adventurer anyways. So
Yep.
like it's just this fun way of like tying it in together and like making all these connections and stuff. So I think that generational adventures add a lot of different story elements that you normally wouldn't be able to get outside of that. And even if it's something that happens off screen, like for example, Ghost within Flavored Enemy, Tales of Vittore. Ghost learned during his session zero that both of his parents were also rogues back in their day.
Oh.
Did not know this about them
Oh.
beforehand, and only figured this out when, as he was getting ready to leave home, they revealed that they've known that he's been a rogue and gifted him their lockpicks. And these kind of
Aw.
like generational adventuring gear and items, you can make them super duper magical and like give all this flavor to them, or they can simply just be a memento that's important to the character to kind of like make
Why
that
didn't I
connection.
write a nice parent into my backstory?
uh, you got
Yeah.
Cadmus. You can't complain.
I got Cadmus. Yeah, no, he's gonna steal the show from maybe not Quincy, but he'll take a bit of the show.
Yeah.
Uh, like you were saying with pulling from the real world, like, oh, you're so much like your mom, you're so much like this. I always told my dad that I would never be an accountant. Guess what I do for
I'm
work
gonna
now?
guess you're an accountant.
Hell yeah. So like where you said, Aurora didn't want to, but she somehow ended up doing, but in her own way. It makes it feel more. It helps to suspend the disbelief. Uh oh, I like this question. Uh, from Quincy for the. What is your opinion on allowing players to create a deity in your setting? And I think that really depends. Like with mine, where my deities came a little bit later, uh, I think that it would work actually very well if I worked with a player and we sort of hashed out that bit of mythos and put them in, and I was able to work that deity either into just that province or if that lore was across the whole world. Um, I think it would be a lot of fun to create deities with my players, depending on what kind of um, why can I not think of the word? Depending on the area, we'll go for that word because I can't think that the deity would sort of represent or oversee. Uh, so for me, I think that that would be a lot of fun, and I would do that in my world.
Yeah. And I think that that is something that allows for room for discussion and such. As such, some people are going to have a very rigid set of what they're thinking for divinity and such. For example, and maybe the world that you've created is monotheistic and only has one god, and that is the only god that there is. If a player has a concept for a deity that exists within your setting, and you like this concept and you want to use it, but your world is monotheistic. One of the things that I've used before is where you have this deity that exists within the world outside of the monotheism. But the real fact is that this deity is in fact not a deity and is only worshipped as if they were a deity. So as kind of like a god king type deal, or like a famed fabled adventurer that ascended to like unreachable heights and now is revered to as a god. Or maybe like a legendary purple worm that shouldn't be worshipped as a god, but is.
But people were like, hell yeah.
You know,
Um, Going on that, if your world doesn't have space for it to be a deity, and depending on what kind of thing it is, there's always cults.
yeah,
Cults are great.
yeah. Cults are great. That's the only time you'll ever hear someone ever say that cults are great.
Oh. Oh.
Right?
Oh, Zala numbers equals letters. I still haven't read enough of the article to even consider that.
Join the cult, people.
Join a cult. Join my cult. I'm working on it.
So we have a follow-up question here from Z. Has a player character ever become a deity or discovered that they have offspring of a deity? So I have a fun little story about it. The deity, or the Palinarum, known as the Darkened within Vittoria, started out as a player character in one of my earlier campaigns that leveled up, grew in power, got to level 20, and was having these big epic adventures. And we slowly started to actually have this encounter. This is because when you get to those high levels, you have these things where, what are you going to do now? You can't just keep sending them after Tarask. It doesn't become fun anymore. So I had this type encounter where they discovered a tablet, a godlike totem of power, and then in a one-on-one D&D session, the player had to learn how to control the powers that came with new divinity, navigate the politics of the celestial planes, and figure out how to balance their personal morals and the requirements that were demanded of them as a god. And it made this very interesting, unique god that exists within Vittoria. That's the Darkened, who is the god of vengeance and bloodshed. Very representative of the desire to seek out vengeance in one's heart. Patron to revenants. He would, the Darkened would like to bring back people from the grave so they can go and seek out their vengeance. Empower them to do so. And it creates kind of like this unique little aspect here. And the fun part is, if you decide to go down this route, right, you now have an extra person who can help you in your world because they know that god better than anybody, even better than yourself sometimes. And it makes like this unique network of things. Now, do I suggest that you do this with all your players so each one of them can ascend to godhood and you don't have to work on building your pantheon because they can do it for you? No, don't do that. That's a bad idea. But if you have...
Don't let players have that much control.
But if you have a player who has put the work in, has developed this big connection to this character, and you can see it turning into this beautiful story moment where you can actually like fully develop this into like this moving and working deity that is not just this simple two-dimensional character within the world, then by all means take that opportunity, because I'll tell you, as someone who's done it, it makes some of the most interesting stories when you have that opportunity.
And I also think part of it comes down to how the deities are either created or ascended in your world.
Exactly.
Because there's some of the, more traditional wizard stuff where there's the physical mantles that hold the, deities, like that ascended level of power type thing, and characters get it. Can they withstand it and take control of it?
Yeah.
Are your deities purely born of a god bloodline and then you can get those offspring? Or would your offspring be closer to like the Genasi, where they could be a player character, but they wouldn't quite have too many bonuses to them? But that you could play around with the storyline of your characters, of your player characters a bit that way. It really comes down to how your deities come to be deities.
Yeah. And I agree. I agree. That's definitely a point that you want to address before you get too much into the nitty gritty of all that. So, as we're kind of like wrapping up here, kind of like finish us out, what would you say is the most important bit of advice that you can give to a fresh, new, young DM who's just getting into building their own world and doesn't know where to start? What's the advice that you would give?
I think the advice that I would give would be your starting concept. Do you have an idea for, like what you did with creation mythos with the deities? Start there, work your way down from the divine plane down onto the physical one, because the deities came about. That might determine how your world starts to look before you even set foot on the ground. Or if you're like me and you have an idea for a conflict in a campaign arc, take that one thing that you have in your mind and build out from it. It doesn't matter where you start with the building, just start at one single point.
Yeah, and I agree. I agree. For from my point of view, one of the best pieces of advice I can give when you're starting out like that is, because of the fact of how overwhelming it can seem to be sometimes, start with just building a town. Start with building a small town that's going to have, what shops, what people that live there. Don't get into too much nitty gritty about the religion or the races that live there. Just the very basics of what kind of people are they? What do they do there? What's the town centered around? Start there. Then once you have that town, then you talk about the city that's nearby. Then you talk about what country is that city in. And you talk about what continent that country's on. And as you start fanning out and getting bigger, you want to contract back down and do it all again until you've slowly started to flesh out all the locations. Once you have that good basis, that good footing of these are all the places, these are all the people, then you can add in little flares about, well, if there's a lot of these farming communities, maybe they have a goddess of agriculture that plays a big important role in this country. And then you can start to create that and add these things that are important to these people and to the world itself. So, start smaller and work your way out, especially when you're at the beginning.
Yeah, and if you get to a point where you're stuck or you don't know, go back one step and maybe take a different route.
Yeah.
Leave what you don't know for now.
Yeah.
Finish it all.
Yeah. And take your time. It's not a race. Thank you for tuning in to Flavored Enemies Behind the Screens. Join us next time as we cover horror and suspense and how to create those things within your campaigns. Thank you, and good night.